It's been a fascinating conference so far, I think, and I hope that what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 minutes or so resonates with earlier presentations and also gives you some insight into the sort of things that we would like to do with regard to salmon conservation. So salmon, I'll come back to why in a second, but we all know the problem with salmon. We've seen this already. Numbers have fallen by a factor of 4 over the last 20 or 30 years. But curiously, in our focus area of Iceland, the picture looks a little bit different. And if you look at Icelandic populations over that same time period, yes, they fluctuated, and for good reason in some cases, for unknown reasons in other cases, but they have stayed, actually, on average, pretty constant. That said, and we're homing in now on our specific area of interest, if you look into East Iceland rivers, which is the focus of our research project and the focus of our conservation efforts, then you start to see maybe signs of some decline in salmon. And so it's with this sort of information that the boss, Jim, asked me to put together a research program and some other measures to try and address and understand, first of all, and then create some actions to try and address the issues facing Atlantic salmon. So what have we done? Well, the research project that we've put in place, we've tried to take a holistic view. First of all, we recognize this is a long-term problem. The life cycle of the salmon is long, etc. And so we've tried to put in some long-term scientific research. And the aim of that research is not just to understand the systems, but also to create practical actions that we can then put into the field. And the way we've done that is we've assembled some great science teams from Imperial College London. Professor Guy Woodward and our PhD student Olivia Morris are in the audience with me here. And we've combined their powers with the Marine and Freshwater Research Institute in Iceland. So that's the start of the research program. It's just kicked off. I'll give you some more insights into that shortly. But in addition to that, we've tried to address some of the other areas where we already know we might be able to help. Installation of salmon ladders, I'll come to that later. Egg planting. So this isn't an Easter activity, I'm sure some of you have come across egg planting, but we're doing that in rivers with the indigenous species. And we're also, as mentioned earlier in the day, actually a couple of times during the day, we also recognize that vegetation plays a role, so we're trying to improve vegetation near rivers. And in Iceland, in many cases, especially East Iceland, which is on the sort of, probably on the brink of survival, I guess, for some species, then vegetation isn't plentiful. So, joint research project launched. We're putting about over £500,000 into it, about £50,000 into it. We've already put 150k to do the preliminary work to convince us that this was worth doing. We've got a couple of PhDs signed up, and the whole thing will get going. And as I say, we want to combine practical stuff with some theoretical stuff, some scientific work, and essentially what we want to do is build a model that describes the Atlantic salmon. One thing that Guy Woodward's taught me, however, is that life is complicated, and it's also complicated for the Atlantic salmon. And as you know, you've seen this, you're far more expert than me in the room on this. So the question is where to start on our piece of work. Well, we're going to start, I think I have a pointer here somewhere, don't I? We're going to start down here, first of all, because I think as we've discussed today, how the salmon gets on in the rivers, how in its early life it gets on, affects the later stages. And we also want to study initially how many come back. And then later in the program, we'll start to add some contribution to what happens in the sea. So another thing that Guy's taught me, as well as life's complicated, you have to consider all points here. So lots of environmental factors in the river. And so you have to consider those if you want to understand what's going, what's important, what's not. The advantage we have in Iceland is we have pristine river systems. We don't have agricultural runoff. The water is the cleanest water I think you could come across, and the system is very simple. So in our rivers, there are 3 fish species. But what we're trying to do is understand how those fish species interact themselves and how they compete in the food web. How they feed on the invertebrates, how much biomass there is in the river. It's just one aspect of that. And the results are quite interesting, and I think start to indicate to us some inroads we can make, I think, into understanding how to support the populations in our river systems. So what I've got here, it looks fairly complicated, doesn't it? But Guy and team have measured here biomass in the river, fish, invertebrates, and algae. Algae feed the invertebrates feed the fish. In our river systems, ignore the red box for the time being, they tend to get a certain ratio between the levels of biomass. And that's normal, especially if you're in the food-starved environment where you're actually mopping up every bit of food you can lay your hands on if you're a salmon or a char. But the interesting thing is Guy's team also looked at another river above an area where there's a waterfall that the salmon actually can't get above. And the reason why we did this is we wanted to look at the ratios of biomass there. And what you can see is the ratio of fish mass up there is much smaller by ratio than in other areas in other rivers. Now, it just so happens that last year we opened a new fish ladder on this river. So one of the things we're going to be doing is bringing that science to bear on the practical intervention of putting a fish ladder in place, which I think will be fascinating to monitor over time. Pit tag systems. Let's talk about pit tag systems. This is something that Guy suggested in conjunction with Rasmus Lauritsen, who's also in the audience today. And so what we want to do in this, in the river systems, and particularly focusing on the Vesterdalse, which is one of the key rivers globally, we want to install, and we have installed actually, monitors for pit tags. What are pit tags? Pit tags are really very small tags which allow you to barcode individual fish. And so what we're doing is putting pit tags into par, and we can put pit tags into smolt, and then we can then observe how they behave in the river, where do they go to, etc. We can observe what happens then when we make other interventions in the river, and we can observe whether that fish that we know, because we saw it, we tagged it, we measured it, makes it bite. So things like size and health of the fish start to come into play there. So we've pit tagged already the Vesterdalse. It's pretty harsh conditions. We've got actually 1,500 smolts tagged so far. And as Rasmus was saying, this is his work, then you can get some surprises from this. We all know you get a spring smolt run. And sure enough, in Iceland, we all talk about that. But when you start to tag the fish, you find there's a migration at a different time of year as well. So you start to learn about the behavior of the fish in the river, which I think can lead us into developing an understanding built into a model of the Atlantic salmon in its early stage of life. So that's one area we're looking at. That's the tag. So it's a very small device. What else are we doing? Well, I said practical interventions. So we're also complementing that with egg planting in these rivers. We are aware of areas in the river that are not inhabited that could be inhabited by the native species for that river. We're also opening up new river areas with salmon ladders. And so what we're doing is taking the native species from the river, extracting eggs, and then putting those eggs into new redds, developing new redds, new breeding areas with those eggs. And that's it's very interesting work. It's led by Gudny, my friend from MFRI. Just some comments on that. We're actually using the many years of salmon spawning experience in the rivers. It employs natural selection because we're using the fish from the rivers, and so the survival of eggs and so on ought to be fairly, I mean, it's one thing to observe, but it ought to be similar. There are limits to it, so you can't infinitely fill the rivers with salmon. We're aware of that. But the whole point here is to open up new breeding grounds, open up new areas of river for the salmon, then monitor what goes on after we've made that intervention. So it'll be quite a few years. And then egg planting process, it's a very practical process. And the latest egg planting took place just recently. So it's pretty cold in Iceland sometimes. And so there's Gudny and my friend Gisli and team planting eggs in a river in Iceland at -10 centigrade. So cold work. But as salmon fisher people, then you must be used to a bit of cold work from time to time in the rivers. The last area is this third point, really, on our holistic approach. It's about land restoration, deforestation. I mean, Iceland did have forests and so on many thousands of years ago, apparently, or even 1,000 or so years ago. long gone in many areas of Iceland, and there's other vegetation that you can encourage in Iceland. So we've enlisted Elsie Muller, who lives in the area, to look at land restoration and afforestation in the rivers of interest to us. And she's actually very, very good, very excited by taking this approach, and has set about adding vegetation and looking at where to plant trees in the catchment areas of the rivers of interest to understand how that, as we said earlier in the day, might promote biomass development and therefore support the population of salmon in the river. It's not something to be done lightly. It needs doing very, very carefully. It needs doing slowly, and it needs doing with monitoring, because these sorts of interventions are quite important for the overall environment, and we don't want any unintended consequences arising from such interventions. But we started the work. The areas of forestation and vegetation are mapped out. We have those in progress already, started it, and we'll see how that goes. We'll be monitoring it over time. So in summary, what I've tried to describe is a holistic program for understanding the salmon, the Atlantic salmon in Icelandic rivers, understanding how to support them, understanding then how to make practical inventions, gathering all that together in a model, installing salmon ladders. We've got more to do, more egg planting, we've got more of that to do, and the vegetation and so on. But it is a long-term program. It does require patience, so we don't see reporting any major results in the next year or so. It's probably going to take a little bit longer than that. So with that, I'd like to thank Mark again and team once more for inviting us and letting us air some of that. I think it is consistent with some of the materials around what's been a great conference for me so far today. And I'd like to thank all of you for listening to me for the last few minutes. Thank you.